That's right. And welcome on Mike Bondiso, who is our head of intermodal solutions out of Dallas, Texas. Mike, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
No problem. Good to see you, Anthony.
Good to see you as well, Mike. And jumping into it, there's a little bit of merger news. What's been going on and what's the latest details as of last week?
Yeah, so the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern merger is maybe not moving as fast as Canadian Pacific would like. I mean, it's still expected to close sort of early 2023, sort of in the first quarter next year when it gets Surface Transportation Board approval, which I think most people are expecting it will get that approval. In the interim, one of the things I thought was interesting last week was on Canadian Pacific's earnings call, they did give a little bit more detail as to what might change in their network as a result of that merger. And one of the interesting things was Canadian Pacific said they've tested 6 or 7 trains from Lázaro Cárdenas, that's on the west coast of Mexico, Port City on the west coast of Mexico, to Chicago, and they're doing that in 7-day transits, and that's competitive with the U.S. West Coast ports, basically ports of LA, Long Beach. You have that heavy corridor from LA to Chicago. They're trying to have a competing service, or at least explore testing a competing service from Mexico to Chicago. That's something that investors have long been excited about. I think having CP and Kansas City Southern under the same corporate umbrella, I think sort of opens up really the potential there. So I think that's something to watch. As the merger gets completed. And they also talked some about domestic intermodal from Chicago down to Laredo, that being a 90-hour transit time. I mean, really sort of domestic intermodal north on the north-south corridors is something where intermodal is punching below its weight class. I mean, they talked about Chicago to Laredo. I'd throw in there Chicago to Dallas, sort of those being 2 huge freight hubs. That's really a truck heavy lane that domestic intermodal really could take share in. With those railroads under one corporate umbrella, they can control how much investment is in both of those. I think both railways are doing things like extending passing sidings, increasing their capacity. So I think in domestic intermodal, I think it's going to lead to volume growth there. They also talked some about the bulk franchises and grain, and Canadian Pacific says it's moved grain from Manitoba as far south as Mexico City, which might validate some of the U.S. farmers' concerns that there might lose share to some Canadian grain for both U.S. consumption and Mexican consumption. Keep in mind, Kansas City Southern moves actually more south across the Mexico border than north because they have such a big grain franchise. So that was interesting. And then they also talked about how, it basically opens up more possibilities with potash, which is a fertilizer that's largely exported out of the Port of Vancouver, that maybe there's more, uses for that, here within North America. So all those things, I think, make the case, CP's case that the merger makes rail more competitive and is therefore ultimately in the best interest. And I think that's why most people, including myself, are expecting the merger to be approved. Now, there are likely to be concessions, but would expect it to be approved first quarter of next year.
Like a lot of folks who have expressed kind of concern over whether or not they will lose options for that cross-border freight, that's been kind of a lot of their sticking point. A lot of shippers have been worried that if this merger goes through, they'll lose their options for who they choose to take their freight cross-border, specifically on that Texas-Mexico border. But it seems like KCS already has a pretty large share of that market down there. And adding, so if they were to add CP to that, it wouldn't necessarily take away, right? Because CP doesn't necessarily do a ton of that southern cross-border freight right now anyways, right? It would just kind of consolidate the options, I guess, instead of really taking away those options for shippers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument that the other railroads are making is that Kansas City Southern, there's a certain segment near Laredo that they have control over, and if now their reach extends to Chicago, Detroit, that they could, in theory, give preferential treatment to freight that originates on what is now the Canadian Pacific Railway, that eventually goes all the way south and basically price freight poorly that, let's say, originates on Union Pacific or Burlington Northern or another railway, and that could therefore be anti-competitive because they would not have give those that other freight that starts on the competing rail line, fair access to that segment of track. So I do think that's maybe a likely concession, is that there will be some rules in place where there has to be transparency, where the railroad has to price that in a certain manner, and that's one thing. I mean, Burlington specifically has been asking for, and that seems like a likely concession to me, because I mean, Surface Transportation Board's main concern is to ensure that this remains a competitive marketplace.
And Mike, with this one, of course, other operators are going to have those worries and concerns. Are there any other potential headwinds that could be facing this potential merger that could be some resistance points for making this happen, or is everything pretty much going to be able to be pretty much eased out?
Well, I mean, the main opposition really has been the other railroads, which makes you think it adds to competition. I mean, most shippers have not really come out against it. A lot have come out for it and say that it's going to increase their options, maybe with the exception of the grain shippers that I mentioned earlier. I mean, the other opposition might be certain communities. A lot of the suburban Chicago homeowners don't like it. Maybe some of the labor groups don't like it. If the ILWU thinks it's going to lose share to the Mexico ports, they'll come out against it maybe, but we'll see. There's going to be a hearing in September, a 3-day hearing, where it's basically a complaint fest of anyone who's against the merger can express their thoughts. So you'll hear from, I think, a lot of the railroads. Canadian National is trying to get a concession where that they would take ownership of what's called the Springfield line, which goes from Kansas City to Springfield, Illinois, which they say would enhance competition to Kansas City, which they say is sort of overlaps with the line from Kansas City to Chicago, which CP doesn't want. So we'll see what happens there. I think that's maybe a little bit more of a longer shot. The one that's more likely is one we talked about earlier with the concessions, I think, near the Mexico border.
It'll be interesting to watch for sure, Mike. Thank you for joining us this morning. Great to have you as always. We'll catch you on the Stock Out this afternoon.
Yeah, good to see you.
And right now, we're going to head back to the wall because we have our next carrier update of the morning.